Welcome to a special investigation episode of By Scoob. Today, we're diving deep into a story that has shaken a Massachusetts community to its core, the case of Sandra Birchmore. What began as a young girl's dream to serve her community through law enforcement became a nightmare of abuse, manipulation, and ultimately, a death that federal investigators now say was murder staged to look like suicide. This is the story of how those sworn to protect became predators, and how a system designed to mentor young people failed catastrophically. I'm your host, Larry Hunter, and this is the Sandra Birchmore story. Let me introduce you to Sandra Marie Birchmore. Born on May 13, 1997, Sandra entered a world where she would face challenges from the very beginning. Raised by her single mother, Denise McCain Birchmore, Sandra never knew her biological father. But this family had something special. They had each other, and they had values. When Sandra was just 4 years old, tragedy struck. Her beloved grandmother, Grace McCain, passed away, leaving a void in their small family. But love has a way of filling empty spaces. Grace's sister, Aunt Claire, stepped forward to become the grandmotherly figure Sandra needed. Sandra's bond with Claire was so strong that she simply called her Grandma. Claire's husband, Gerald, was a World War II veteran, a man who wore his service with quiet pride. He had earned the Good Conduct Medal, the Victory Medal, the American Campaign Medal, and the European African Middle Eastern Campaign Medal, with 3 Bronze Stars. Gerald represented something Sandra would carry with her throughout her life: respect for those who serve their community and country. This was Sandra's world in Stoughton, Massachusetts. A world where service mattered, where helping others was a family value, where looking up to people in uniform felt natural and right. With both her uncle and her stepfather having military backgrounds, 8-year-old Sandra was enrolled in a police youth program. It seemed like the perfect fit for a girl who wanted to help people and make a difference. Those who knew Sandra described her as someone special. She was determined, friendly, and curious, especially about law enforcement. At 12, she took a step that would change her life forever. She joined the Stoughton Police Explorers program. This youth outreach activity was designed for young people interested in law enforcement, and Sandra talked about it with pride. Her mother and grandmother supported her involvement because it gave Sandra structure and a sense of purpose. But Sandra's childhood wasn't easy. As her mother, Denise, became increasingly ill with chronic conditions that prevented her from working full-time, Sandra took on more responsibility at home. Friends said she was always trying to do the right thing, always trying to be responsible. She talked about becoming a nurse someday, dreaming of a career dedicated to helping others heal. Later in life, Sandra would pursue that dream, taking nursing courses at Massasoit Community College while working as a teacher's assistant at an elementary school in Sharon. Children responded to her warmth and patience. She had that special quality that made kids feel safe and understood. Here's where Sandra's story takes its dark turn. In the Police Explorers program, Sandra met Matthew Farwell, a 25-year-old Stoughton police officer assigned as an instructor. To Sandra, he represented everything she admired: authority, guidance, protection. To federal prosecutors, he represents something entirely different: a predator who saw vulnerability and opportunity. Matthew Farwell wasn't just any police officer. He was married in 2013, seen by colleagues as experienced and confident. His role as an instructor in the Police Explorers program gave him access to impressionable teenagers, and according to federal prosecutors, he exploited that access in the most heinous way possible. But Matthew wasn't working alone in this web of abuse. His twin brother William, who went by Billy, also engaged in inappropriate behavior with Sandra. A third officer, Robert Devine, who actually supervised the Explorers program, was also accused of inappropriate interactions. This wasn't just one bad apple. This was a systematic exploitation of a vulnerable young woman by multiple adults who held positions of trust. Let me paint you a picture of how deep this corruption ran. Back in the early 2000s, Robert Devine worked as a lunchroom and hallway monitor, chaperoning kids in after-school programs. One female student developed a crush on him. Not unusual, but how you handle it makes all the difference. Devine took advantage. When the student wrote him a love letter, he brought her into his office, lifted her onto his desk, told her she was a knockout, and promised to take her on a date when she turned 18. He then hugged and kissed her on the forehead. And guess who was watching all this unfold? The Farwell brothers. They were students at the time, under Devine's wing, learning what they thought leadership looked like. This was their mentor, showing them how men in power could exploit young women who looked up to them. The grooming of Sandra began with what seemed like innocent help. Matthew offered to tutor her at the Stoughton Public Library in 2011 when she was just 13 years old, a child seeking help with her homework from a man 12 years her senior. It started with supposed study sessions, but escalated when Matthew sent Sandra a friend request on Facebook on October 28, 2012. Remember, nothing online ever truly disappears. Those messages would later become crucial evidence of a calculated campaign of manipulation. Between 2012 and 2013, when Sandra was only 15, their interactions became physical. On April 10, 2013, Matthew Farwell took Sandra's virginity. She was 15. He was 27. By Massachusetts law, this was statutory assault. The age of consent is 16. Here's the truly sickening part. Matthew married his girlfriend Michelle just 1 month later, on May 11, 2013. He was stealing a child's innocence just weeks before making public vows to another woman. Sandra, meanwhile, believed she was in a real, genuine relationship. That's exactly what Matthew wanted her to believe. She was even with him on her prom night instead of celebrating with friends her own age. She documented their relationship in her journal, not understanding that she was documenting her own abuse. How did this happen? How did multiple predators gain access to vulnerable young people with such ease? The answer lies in a system that prioritized appearances over accountability. The Farwell brothers had their own troubling history with law enforcement. In 1998, at age 12, they joined the Police Explorers program. But in 2001, when they were 16, they were caught impersonating police officers, actually pulling over cars and pretending to be real officers. This should have been a massive red flag. Instead, just 2 years later, in 2003, Robert Devine invited them to become guest instructors for the Explorers. Let that sink in for a moment. 2 teenagers caught impersonating police officers were welcomed back as instructors for younger children. Matthew got his GED and enlisted in the Army, where he trained as an explosives expert and served in Afghanistan. When he returned in 2008, he was hired by the Wellesley Police Department and later became a Stoughton police officer in 2012. Guess who was on the hiring board that year? Robert Devine, the same man who had overlooked their previous misconduct and welcomed them back as instructors. The Stoughton Police Department even celebrated Matthew's hiring with a social media post describing him as a local boy who's happy to be bringing his skills home. The Police Explorers program was supposed to be about giving young people structure and purpose. The official description stated it was for motivated teens in a physically and mentally demanding program based loosely on an actual police academy experience. The primary purpose was to give youth non-confrontational interactions with Stoughton police officers and prepare them for careers in public service. But there was a critical flaw in the system: inadequate oversight and supervision of adult instructors working with minors. The program created opportunities for unsupervised interactions between adults in positions of authority and vulnerable young people. Sandra was often the only girl in program photos, surrounded by older boys and adult men who saw her vulnerability as opportunity, rather than something to protect. As Sandra grew older, the abuse didn't stop. It evolved and expanded. After high school, Sandra wanted to join the military, so she reached out to Billy Farwell for advice about recruitment. He had finally become a Stoughton police officer like his brother in 2017. What should have been professional mentoring became another avenue for exploitation. Billy told Sandra he would connect her with a recruiter, which he did. But during this time, Billy and Sandra also started exchanging messages through text and email. Messages that escalated into inappropriate content, similar to what she was already sharing with his brother Matthew. Sandra spent 2 months in the U.S. Army Reserve, but didn't make it past boot camp. She enrolled in community college in Brockton instead, completing her studies in 2018. Then, she took the statewide Massachusetts civil service exam, trying to fulfill her dream of becoming a Stoughton police officer. She was actually placed on the eligibility list for the force, but the men who had been exploiting her weren't going to let that happen. By 2019, Sandra found herself in sexual relationships with both Farwell brothers. She was being passed around between them like an object. Each brother would later claim that Sandra initiated everything, that she wanted it. Classic predator behavior, blaming the victim they had groomed from childhood. Evidence shows both Billy and Matthew were exchanging text messages with Sandra during their paid work shifts, conduct that violated department rules and regulations. Billy was even conducting unauthorized computer searches, looking up Sandra's name twice in 2019 and searching his own name at least 24 times dating back to 2017. He was using company computers for personal business, possibly checking to see if complaints had been filed against him. This wasn't just personal misconduct. This was a systematic abuse of power, resources, and public trust. Multiple officers were using their positions, their access, and their authority to exploit a young woman they had been grooming since she was a child. In the fall of 2020, Sandra's life took another dramatic turn. She discovered she was pregnant. She was about 3 months along, and, according to friends and federal court documents, she was excited about becoming a mother. She booked prenatal care, talked about ultrasounds, and planned to announce the pregnancy around Valentine's Day. Sandra told Matthew Farwell that she believed he was the father and that she wanted him involved in the child's life. She wanted his name on the birth certificate. She had dreams of a normal family, a normal relationship, things that had been stolen from her when she was just a child. But Farwell's reaction was not what she hoped for. Court records allege he reacted very poorly to the news. In at least one incident while she was pregnant, Farwell allegedly held Sandra in a headlock and told her he wished she were dead. The indictment shows that their conversations became increasingly tense after she revealed her pregnancy in December 2020. While Sandra was expressing excitement about due dates, ultrasounds, and baby preparations, Farwell was telling her she was the worst person on the face of the earth when she insisted on keeping the pregnancy and putting his name on the birth certificate. Here's where the story gets even more complex. Recent DNA testing has shown that Farwell was not actually the biological father of Sandra's unborn child. But here's what matters. Sandra believed he was, and that belief shaped her decisions and hopes. She was planning a future based on what she thought was true, what she had been manipulated into believing for years. At work, Sandra's behavior began to concern her supervisors. She was oversharing with school employees, telling people about her desire to get pregnant, saying her boyfriend finally said yes. She was announcing her pregnancy when she was only 4 or 5 weeks along, which her boss found unusual. She was telling people she hardly knew intimate details about her relationship with an older cop from the Stoughton Police Department who had gotten her pregnant, but whose wife couldn't find out. Sandra would talk about visitation plans, about which holidays they'd spend with the baby, about him agreeing to be part of the baby's life. But these weren't real plans. They were fantasies she was speaking into existence, hoping and dreaming for the normal relationship she had never been allowed to have. By January 2021, Sandra was back in text threads with Matthew, asking if the baby could have his last name. But he refused to discuss it over text, which was significant because their entire relationship had been documented through thousands of text messages discussing intimate details, sexual fantasies, and even violent acts, including choking and forced intercourse. Why was this different? Because Matthew was feeling pressure. He was scared his secret was going to be exposed, especially if that secret became flesh and blood in the form of a baby. Federal court filings reveal that about a week before Sandra died, Farwell visited her apartment unannounced, asked her for a spare key, and searched through her closets and bathroom in a way that made her uncomfortable. This wasn't normal behavior for their relationship. It suggested he might have been looking for something she could use against him. On January 20th, 2021, a friend contacted police to report Sandra's situation. After this, Farwell sent a series of angry and suspicious texts indicating fear that their relationship would be exposed. The walls were closing in, and he knew it. On February 4th, 2021, officers from the Canton Police Department went to Sandra Birchmore's apartment at Windsor Woods in Canton, Massachusetts. She hadn't been seen for several days and had failed to show up for work. When they entered her apartment and walked through the living area into her bedroom, they found Sandra's body. She was lying in her bedroom with a strap from a gym bag tied to a doorknob and around her neck. Paramedics determined that Sandra was dead. Her body was taken to the office of the chief medical examiner, and the scene was photographed and documented. When the medical examiner's office conducted an autopsy in early May 2021, the official ruling was suicide by hanging. The death certificate listed suicide as the cause of death, noting that she had died by asphyxia. Investigators at the time believed there was no evidence of foul play, taking into account Sandra's personal history and what was found at the scene. But this ruling shocked many people close to Sandra. In the weeks before her death, she had been planning for the future, excited about becoming a mother, booking prenatal appointments, and talking about baby names and ultrasounds. None of them saw clear signs that she wanted to hurt herself. Sandra's family couldn't accept the suicide ruling. They hired independent experts to review the case, including Dr. Michael Baden, a renowned forensic pathologist who had worked on many high-profile cases. Dr. Baden concluded that Sandra's death appeared to be homicide by manual strangulation rather than suicide. He pointed to specific evidence: a fractured bone in her neck, the way the ligature was positioned, and the absence of a suicide note. These factors, he argued, were more consistent with someone being strangled than with self-inflicted hanging. The family also filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the town of Stoughton and the former officers involved, arguing that negligent hiring, supervision, and oversight by the police department led to Sandra's emotional distress and ultimately her death. As questions mounted, more disturbing details emerged. The Massachusetts Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission eventually decertified former Stoughton Deputy Chief Robert Devine after finding that he had engaged in unprofessional conduct involving Sandra, including inappropriate communications and sexual encounters. The commission noted that Devine had lied to internal investigators and exploited his position of power over her when she was vulnerable. The inconsistencies and red flags were too significant to ignore. Federal investigators reopened the case, conducting their own thorough investigation. What they found was enough to bring federal charges against Matthew Farwell in 2024. The federal indictment alleges that Farwell strangled Sandra in her apartment on February 1, 2021, and then staged the scene to make it appear she had committed suicide. Prosecutors claim he did this to prevent Sandra from revealing their secret relationship and his criminal conduct, which included sexual abuse that began when she was just 15 years old. The charges now stand in direct contrast to the original ruling by the state medical examiner, bringing new scrutiny to what was first described as a tragic suicide. Federal prosecutors argue that this was murder, the final, ultimate act of control by a man who had been controlling and abusing Sandra since she was a child. Sandra Birchmore's story isn't just about one young woman and the predators who destroyed her life. It's about systemic failures that allowed this abuse to continue for years. It's about a police department that overlooked red flags, failed to provide adequate oversight, and allowed officers with troubling histories to mentor vulnerable young people. The case has exposed critical flaws in youth mentoring programs, particularly those run by law enforcement agencies. How did multiple officers gain unsupervised access to a vulnerable minor? How were their inappropriate behaviors overlooked or ignored? How did a system designed to protect and guide young people become a hunting ground for predators? The town of Stoughton has faced significant criticism for its handling of the Police Explorers program and its failure to protect Sandra. The case has sparked calls for reform in how such programs are structured, supervised, and monitored. Canton Police, where Sandra's body was found, were also audited in 2025 regarding their handling of crime scene work and investigative procedures. While the audit said officers followed basic procedures, critics argue that independent investigators should have been involved from the beginning, especially given the involvement of law enforcement officers in Sandra's personal life. Sandra Birchmore was more than the headlines. A young woman who cared for others, stepped up when her family needed her, and dreamed of becoming a nurse. From 13, she was manipulated by those meant to protect her, yet she kept moving forward, working, studying, and hoping for a future she never got to live. Her story isn't just tragedy. It raises hard questions about power, accountability, and the systems meant to safeguard the vulnerable. And as the legal case unfolds, one question still lingers. What truths remain uncovered, and how many warnings were missed along the way? To explore the full story and the details we couldn't cover here, download the Scoob app now and dive deeper into the investigation.